All right, I want everybody to know some good philosophy. It is out there, even though most of it's crap. And this is a good one. This is one of my favorites. I really like Aphorism 16, actually, but we won't get... So it's Fred Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil, a prelude to a philosophy of the future. Okay, so let's start with the preface. Since it's a classic, we'll read even the preface. Usually skip that shit, right? Okay. Supposing truth is a woman, what then? Are there not grounds for the suspicion that all philosophers, insofar as they were dogmatists, have been very inexpert about women? Inexpert? Yeah. Insofar as they were dogmatists. That's the part I like right away. I think Nietzsche is a secret skeptic. Doesn't come out and say it because there's problems with that rhetoric, but it's clear. But then again, I think Nietzsche, it's possible he's like a mirror and sometimes you see yourself in it, so you have to be careful. Okay. That the gruesome seriousness, the clumsy obtrusiveness with which they have usually approached truth so far have been awkward and very improper methods for winning a woman's heart. What is certain is that she has not allowed herself to be won. In other words, nobody has the truth. That's certain. And today, every kind of dogmatism is left standing dispirited and discouraged. I like to think that. We like to think that. There's at least a grain of truth in that. If it is left standing at all. For there are scoffers who claim that it has fallen, that all dogmatism lies on the ground, even more that all dogmatism is dying. I hope that. I used to think that. Okay, speaking seriously, there are good reasons. Speaking seriously. In other words, obviously, that hasn't happened. Of course, this is from 1886, I think. But that's what you gotta love about Nietzsche. He says it's many people saying it's gone. He says, speaking seriously, there are good reasons why all philosophical dogmatizing, however solemn and definitive its airs used to be, may nevertheless have been no more than a noble childness and tyrannism. And perhaps the time is at hand when it will be comprehended again and again how little used to be sufficient to furnish the cornerstone for such sublime and unconditional philosophers' edifices as the dogmatists have built so far. Any old popular superstition from the time immemorial, like the soul superstition, in the form of the subject and ego superstition, has not even yet ceased to do mischief. Some play on words, perhaps, a seduction by grammar, or an audacious generalization of very narrow, very personal, very human, all too human facts. Human, all too human. He made a whole book with that sentence before. Look, I got my eye itches. The doctor says, don't touch your eye. Okay. He translates really well. Okay, the dogmatist's philosophy was, let us hope, only a promise across millennia, as astrology was in still earlier times, when perhaps more work, money, acuteness, and patience were lavished in its service than for any real science so far. To astrology and its supra-terrestrial claims, we owe the grand style of architecture in Asia and Egypt. It's like, what is he talking about? It's a historical illusion. Okay. It seems that all great things first have to bestride the earth in monstrous and frightening masks in order to inscribe themselves in the hearts of humanity with eternal demands. Dogmatic philosophy was such a mask. For example, the Vedanta doctrine in Asia and Platonism in Europe. I mean, you don't have to try to understand every allusion, every issue in something like that. Okay, but the point is, he's talking about dogmatism. Let us not be ungrateful to it, although it must certainly be conceded that the worst, most durable, and most dangerous of all errors so far was a dogmatist's error. Okay, listen to that again. Let us not be ungrateful to it being dogmatism. He's calling out how it's terrible, the biggest mistakes. But let's not be ungrateful to it. This is an important way of thinking in Nietzsche. You know, it's a yin-yang kind of thing. He ended up understanding Christianity as a necessary stage of human development, right? You need to have something to get beyond it and so on. So there becomes a lot of sense to, I don't know, to whatever happens. Let's just put it that way for now. So let us not be ungrateful to it, although it must certainly be conceded that the worst, most durable, and most dangerous of all errors so far was a dogmatist's error, namely Plato's invention of the pure spirit and the good as such. I really believe in that. Agree with that, I mean. But now that it is overcome, optimistic statement, he puts that stuff in. He doesn't actually think that you should buy that. He puts things in. I try to borrow this technique where you put something in that you don't think your audience ought to buy. It's like, you guys should call me on this. And then, I don't know exactly why we do it. I do think there's a reason, but it's hard to prove. But now that it is overcome, now that Europe is breathing freely again after this nightmare and at least can enjoy healthier sleep, we, whose task is wakefulness itself, are the heirs of all that strength which has been fostered by the fight against this error. Okay, so this is important in this book, okay? Nietzsche, you really want to, there's like, he'll write a sentence about something and it's almost, it might be poetic or maybe it sounds literal or whatever, and there'll be some subphrase that's a key to the rest of the book. The book is done in aphorisms. They're, you know, small, sometimes just a couple lines, right? But there's a theme, and this is something that should be pointed out. This phrase in the sentence of we, and in italic, whose task is wakefulness itself. He'll often in this book talk about we, and he's saying we free spirits, we atheists that look at this differently, we who think the dogmatism of the past is a bit silly. But let us not be ungrateful to it. We're silly too, or whatever, however you want to balance the equation out, just because he's criticizing it. We, whose task is wakefulness itself, are the heirs of all that strength which has been fostered. Okay. By the fight against this error. To be sure, it meant standing truth on her head and denying perspective. Perspective is the real truth. To be sure, it meant standing truth on her head and denying. You can't deny perspective. This is fundamental in my philosophy. And this may be, I don't think Nietzsche's where that comes from, but it's kind of why I said, oh, you know, even though I don't agree with a lot of his conclusions or things he said here and there, it's almost like he's writing a weird mixture of philosophy and allegory and myth and story. And when you get right down to it, it's these little things like, you know, like a statement like that. To be sure, it meant standing truth on her head and denying perspective, the basic condition of all life. When one spoke of spirit and the good as Plato did. Indeed, as a physician, one might ask, how could the most beautiful growth of antiquity, Plato, contract such a disease? Did the wicked Socrates corrupt him after all? Could Socrates have been the corrupter of youth after all? And did he deserve his hemlock? Because that's why they killed He was convicted of corrupting the youth of Athens, refused to leave, to be exiled. But the fight against Plato, or to speak more clearly and for the people, the fight against the Christian ecclesiastical pressure of millennia, for Christianity is Platonism for the people. You hear that? Christianity is Platonism for the people. That's true. Has created in Europe, and that's definitely something Nietzsche convinced me of, has created in Europe a magnificent tension of the spirit, the like of which had never yet existed on earth. With so tense a bow, we can now shoot for the most distant goals. So the fight against dogmatism has created a tense bow that we can shoot for distant goals with. Things come from their opposite, is one of Nietzsche's things. Right? Things come from their opposite. You got Christianity, the fight for it creates something that can achieve something still different, perhaps, but related. To be sure, European man experiences this tension as need and distress. Twice already attempts have been made in the grand style to unbend the bow, once by means of Jesuitism, and the second time by means of the democratic Enlightenment, which, with the aid of freedom of the press and newspaper reading, might indeed bring it about that the spirit would no longer experience itself so easily as a need. Parentheses, the Germans have invented gunpowder, all due respect for that, but then they made up for that. They invented the press. It's not literally, he's not saying they invented gunpowder, but but we who are neither Jesuits nor Democrats, nor even German enough, we good Europeans and free, very free spirits, we still feel it. The whole need of the spirit and the whole tension of its bow. And perhaps also the arrow, the task, and who knows, the God. 1885. All right. Well, I'm going to read a couple more, I think, but that's the preface. Part 1 on the prejudices of philosophers. Okay, so we have some people trying to badmouth philosophers. I think Nietzsche does a pretty good job of it. Nietzsche. I like to call him Nietzsche, but whatever. So part 1. Alright, aphorism 1 of part 1. Page 9 in my copy of Beyond Good and Evil. What a great name for a book. Okay. The will to truth, which will still tempt us to many a venture, that famous truthfulness of which all philosophers so far have spoken with respect, what question has this will to truth not laid before us? What strange, wicked, questionable questions? That is a long story even now, and yet it seems as if it had scarcely begun. It is any wonder that we should finally become suspicious, lose patience, and turn away impatiently? That we should finally learn from this Sphinx to ask questions too? Who is it really that puts questions to us here? What in us really wants the truth? And this question relates to what we do here on YouTube, those of us that talk issues, whether we want to call it philosophy or something else, atheism, antinatalism, will, whatever. What in us really wants, quote unquote, truth? Is it any wonder that we should finally become suspicious, lose patience, and turn away impatiently? Okay. Indeed, we came to a long halt at the question about the cause of this will, until we finally came to a complete stop before a still more basic question. We asked about the value of this will. What value is it to want truth? Suppose we want the truth. Why not rather untruth? And uncertainty? And even ignorance? Suppose we want the truth. We, remember, from the preface, we, who we is, it's going to always be the same we, the rest of the book. We, whose task is wakefulness itself. What in us wants the truth? Why not rather untruth or uncertainty, even ignorance? The problem of the value of truth came before us, or was it we who came before the problem? Who of us is Oedipus here? Who is the Sphinx? Yeah, not that other Oedipus part, but where Oedipus is at the Sphinx. It is a rendezvous, it seems, of questions and question marks. That's good language there. It translates well, even. It's a rendezvous, it seems, of questions and question marks. And though it scarcely seems credible, it finally almost seems to us as if the problem had never even been put so far, as if we were the first to see it, fix it with our eyes, and risk this question of why not rather untruth, right? For it does involve a risk, and perhaps there is none that is greater. That's aphorism 1. Why not prefer untruth? All right, aphorism 2 of On the Prejudices of Philosophers. How could anything originate out of, quote, how could anything originate out of its opposite? For example, truth out of error, or the will to truth out of the will to deception, or selfless deeds out of selfishness, or the pure and sunlight gaze of the sage out of lust. Such origins are impossible. Remember, this is quoted. This is Nietzsche having someone else say this. Such origins are impossible. Whoever dreams of them is a fool. Indeed, worse, the things of the highest value must have another peculiar origin. They cannot be derived from this transitory, seductive, deceptive, paltry world, from this turmoil of delusion and lust, rather from the lap of being, capital B. The intransitory, the hidden God, the thing in itself, quote unquote. There must be their basis and nowhere else, end quote. I notice when people analyze Nietzsche, they don't really notice his use of standard literary things like this, or they ignore them, and it's like statements like this often people will quote as though Nietzsche said this. No, this is Nietzsche quoting someone else that he's actually going to satire a little bit. But as with most things, he'll give credit where due, rather. But that's not Nietzsche's position. He believes things do come from their opposite. This way of judging constitutes the typical prejudgment and prejudice which give away the metaphysicians of all ages. This kind of valuation looms in the background of all their logical procedures. It is on account of this quote-unquote faith that they trouble themselves about quote-unquote knowledge, about something that is finally baptized solemnly as the truth. The fundamental faith, and that's also quoted, the fundamental faith of the metaphysicians is the faith in opposite values. Faith in opposite values. Do you have that? Do you guys have faith that opposite values are valid, that values come in opposition? For example, this objective suffering and a thing and pleasure. Well, we actually have different nerves giving impulses that our brain interprets as suffering versus the ones that send impulses we interpret as pleasure. They're not opposites. They're actually two different things that are in, can be put in of counterposition. It has not even occurred to the most cautious among them that one might have a doubt right here at the threshold where it was surely most necessary, even if they vowed to themselves, de omnibus dubitandum, which means all is to be doubted. It's a quote from Descartes. De omnibus dubitandum. Dubitandum. My Latin isn't so hot. Okay. I did take Latin in high school, though, so it should be better. Okay. For one may doubt first whether there are any opposites at all. And secondly, whether these popular valuations and opposite values on which the metaphysicians put their seal are not perhaps merely foreground estimates, only provisional perspectives, perhaps even from some nook, perhaps from below, a frog perspective, as it were, to borrow the expression that painters use. For all the value that the true, the truthful, the selfless may deserve, it would still be possible that a higher and more fundamental value for life might have to be ascribed to deception, selfishness, and lust. It might even be possible that what constitutes the value of these good and revered things is precisely that they are insidiously related, tied to, and involved with these wicked, seemingly opposite things, maybe even one with them in essence, maybe. Again, this is the kind of thing where people go, oh, look, he's saying this. Maybe. Okay, so this is a possibility. Okay, now my view is that Nietzsche then says, well, whatever, I like truth. I'm going with that. I don't have to, we have a will to power. Doing things that help your survival is just incidental result of that. Maybe that's why we genetically developed this will, but whatever. I can follow a will to truth or whatever. I don't necessarily have to explain it. It's an interesting issue of whether or not he thinks he explains it, because I think he does explain it, but he doesn't justify it. It's like it's not necessarily bothered to be justified. So, on the other hand, he is pointing out that we can't assume the value of truth compared to the value of deception. On the other hand, yet another hand, he's a philosopher. He's like, I'm one of these guys. I love truth. I just admit I can't really explain or justify it in the traditional ways that philosophers have tried to justify it. Those ways seem lacking. But who has the will to concern himself with such dangerous maybes? Okay, he admits this is a dangerous maybe. For that, one really has to wait for the advent of a new species of philosophers, such as have somehow another and converse taste and propensity from those we have known so far. Philosophers of the dangerous maybe, in every sense. And in all seriousness, I see such new philosophers coming up. Me too. The prejudices of philosophers. This is going to finish it up for this video. After having looked long enough between the philosopher's lines and fingers, I say to myself, by far the greater part of conscious thinking must still be included among instinctive activities. And that goes even for philosophical thinking. Hello? I believe this strongly. After having looked long enough between the philosopher's lines and fingers, okay, that's just like, after looking into this stuff, I say to myself, by far the greater part of conscious thinking must still be included among instinctive activities. And that goes even for philosophical thinking. Right? I believe that. I agree with that. Do you guys see what that means? For example, philosophical emotions. Eureka! I've had that emotion. Emotions drive philosophy as well. Maybe they're better emotions, but not necessarily. Maybe they're worse emotions, but not probably. We have to relearn here, as one has had to relearn about heredity and what is innate, quote unquote. As the act of birth deserves no consideration in the whole process and procedure of heredity, so being conscious is not in any decisive sense the opposite of what is instinctive. Just as the act of birth deserves no consideration in the whole process and procedure of heredity, so, quote unquote, being conscious is not in any decisive sense the opposite of what is instinctive. Most of the conscious thinking of a philosopher is secretly guided and forced into certain channels by his instincts. Right, this is a realism. Everybody could just realize that. It can mean a lot of different things depending on who you're dealing with and what their instincts are and how they acquired these said instincts. But when we discuss free and constrained will and stuff, this is kind of what I'm thinking about, because I believe there's such a thing as willpower, but I also agree with this. Being conscious is not in any decisive sense the opposite of what is instinctive. Do you see how the thing about Nietzsche, and when he brings up terms like thing in itself, and he's analyzing thing in itself, they were still teaching me in the 90s, in the late 80s, thing in itself based philosophy, where that's a really important term, and he laid all that bare, and they haven't addressed this. They haven't really dealt with this. This idea that you got your instincts and you have what you think consciously. We don't have to have an answer of how could they not be opposites to say, look, maybe those aren't really opposites. You could arrange them on opposite sides of a balance, of a teeter-totter, or different points of a hexagon. Doesn't make them opposites in some fundamental sense. But I think this is a truism that, these things are put into certain channels by instincts. Behind all logic and its seeming sovereignty of movement, too, there stands valuations, or more clearly, physiological demands for the preservation of certain types of life. Behind all logic and its seeming sovereignty of movement, too, there stand evaluations, or more clearly, physiological demands for the preservation of a certain type of life. For example, that the definite should be worth more than the indefinite, and mere appearance worth less than truth. Such estimates might be in spite of their regulative importance for us again, nevertheless mere foreground estimates, a certain kind of French word, nausea. What's that? There's a footnote. Folly, stupidity, silliness, which may be necessary for the preservation of just such beings as we are. So we might need these lies to survive. Sound familiar, anybody? Yeah, I think some people agree with that point more than I do. But he's saying maybe they might be necessary. These are the possibilities. Now it's my position that he answers these questions. Supposing, that is, that not just man is the measure of things. This This is real philosophy.